Chesapeake Bay. It's not just the largest estuary in North America, it's one of the most productive bodies of water on the planet. More than 250 fish species use the bay and its tributaries for some portion of their life cycles, including American and hickory shad, river herring, striped bass, eel, weakfish, bluefish, flounder, oysters, and blue crabs. The estuary and its network of streams, creeks, and rivers hold tremendous ecological, cultural, economic, historic, and recreational value for the region, and it has for centuries. Long before English settlers arrived, native tribes inhabited the region, using Chesapeake Bay as a source of sustenance, a transportation lifeline, and a home. In addition to agriculture and hunting, the Bay region provided native families with plentiful shellfish. According to the National Park Service, the tribes living in the region fish the bay on a large scale. Today, Chesapeake Bay continues to share its bounty through a wide range of commercial fishing, from entrepreneurial watermen and oyster farmers to a major factory that provides jobs throughout the northern neck of Virginia and beyond. You might say this is a fish story, how Chesapeake Bay built the northern neck. In colonial times, fish and shellfish from Chesapeake Bay supplemented wild game and agricultural products, setting the stage for an explosion of a commercial fishing industry that anyone could take part in as long as they possessed a boat. It wasn't long before the business of fishing the bay took on a life of its own.
Right after the Civil War, which ended in 1865, a fellow from up in Maine, Brookline, Maine, named Elijah Reed, came to the Chesapeake Bay, and there were lots of boats in, say, Long Island Sound, and the competition was fierce, so he brought his two boats, and these weren't big fancy boats. They were 40-foot boats with a net and a crew and a big pot to cook the fish in. But he heard about a guy up here at Reedville, Chesapeake Beach, who was putting out fish traps. He was from Long Island. He brought fish trapping to the Chesapeake Bay. This is where he put stakes in the bottom and nets along the stakes, and the fish go into a pound. So he came up because that fellow was catching a lot of menhaden in his fish traps, and he thought, well, if they're menhaden in fish traps, there'll be something for me to catch in my nets. So he brought his two boats up to Reedville, and he started making some money. And that's the first menhaden fishing done in this area. He wound up, after a few years, making enough money to buy a peninsula which had no name. It was 33 acres of forest, and it later became Reedville. Incidentally, he paid $1,000 for the 33 acres of land. And he built a fish factory at the end of it, on the land. It was the first land-based fish factory. Before that, they'd take their boats and their nets and their kettles, and wherever they caught the fish, they'd cook them on the shore. And he had it all set up. They'd bring the fish to his factory, his plant, and he would cook them, press the fish, get the oil out of them, and then grind up the fish that was cooked and make scrap. And scrap had a high value as poultry feed at that time.
But in the Northern Neck, you did not need a factory to make money in the fishing industry. Fishing villages sprang up along the rivers and the bay, where fishing was the lifeblood of the community. A good example is Marattica on the Rappahannock River in Lancaster County. In 2009, Marattica native Frank Saunders took us on a tour explaining how the entire community made its living from the water.
When I was a boy, the little duck blind thing you see out there was a shell pile, and there were crab houses on pilings all along it paralleled the shoreline about 200 yards offshore. And the men, they would have to carry ice out to their crab houses because they'd have to ice down the soft crabs before they shipped them. And an ice truck would come from Tappahannock to the village every day, And they would deliver 100-pound blocks of ice, and those men would have to use tongs and drag those huge blocks of ice down on the dock, load it into a skiff, paddle the skiff out to the crab houses, take that 100-pound block of ice, put it up on the dock into the crab house, and then take ice picks and crush it up and mash it, and then put it on top of the soft crabs to prepare them for market to Baltimore and Norfolk. So a lot of activity in this area back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s.
It was a hard way to make a living, but it could be quite profitable.
Well, watermen are like farmers. They never make any money, if you listen to what they say. But they had to make pretty good money because they were buying automobiles, they were buying or expanding or improving their homes, so they made a pretty comfortable living. None of them were wealthy, that's for sure. And that's the miracle of the store. That's why we commemorate it into a museum.
The store, just about the only business in Marataka, was a critically important institution in the life of the community.
For all of my life, the store was owned by Brian and Margaret Johnson, and Brian really took the store to another level in terms of inventory and stock. It was everything in the store. There was a pot-bellied coal stove that stood where this stove is now. There was always a bucket of coal. That was the only coal in Marataka. We didn't even know what coal was. But the store always had a coal-burning stove. There were benches that lined both sides of the open area of the store. And every weeknight, those benches were lined with all the men in the village. After dinner, they would get cleaned up after work, come down to the store, socialize, eat peanuts and drink Cokes, and tell lies for 2 hours and go home. There was more oysters and crabs caught in this room than ever lived in the Rappahannock River. And it was just a great place to be a boy and walk in and kind of be in the middle of all of that.
Fishing was a seasonal activity in Marataka and other northern neck fishing villages. In the spring, summer, and fall, crabbing was a major activity, with blue crabs shipped to surrounding cities. And it provided jobs throughout the area.
And the way the crab house worked, the crab pickers would come in at 3 a.m. and they would start picking crabs. And they would pick anywhere from 15 to 20 tons of hard crabs a day. And they would do that 5 days a week. And then in the afternoons, after they left and the crab house was cleaned up, then the crabs, the actual hard crabs themselves, would come in by boat, by truck, and then they would be cooked in the cookers every afternoon to get ready for the next day's picking. So your work day, my dad would go to work at 1 a.m. to get things ready for the pickers. Then they would pick crabs from 3 in the morning until about noon. Then they would go home, we'd clean up, we'd go home and get some lunch, come back at 2, and we'd cook crabs from 2 till 6. And then you'd start all over again the next morning at between 1 and 3 o'clock. So it was a long, hard day, and that's pretty much the way the crab house ran.
In the winter, the men turned to oystering, again earning good money for their catch. But a particularly harsh winter could be trouble. If the creeks froze, you could go weeks without catching or selling anything, making for something of a Spartan lifestyle.
That's very true. My cousin and I have often joked about how hard it was just to get food to eat, and how hard it was just to have wood to provide heat in the winter. And all of the basic elements of living were hard. They involved a lot of work and a lot of sacrifice. And most of these men in the village worked out in the river. In the summer it was hot, full of sea nettles and all kinds of perils of the weather and the water. And then in the winter, when oyster season was in, then you had to deal with the freezing cold, the river being frozen over. All of that affected income, and when you didn't have income, you depended on whoever owned the store to carry you. They had a little journal back behind that counter right beside the cash register, and you would buy something, instead of paying for it, they would make an entry in your journal. And when you had money, you'd pay the storekeeper, and many times he didn't get paid. I can remember Brian saying when somebody would die in the village, he would tear the journal page out of the book, ball it up and throw it in the trash can, and he'd always say, "Jesus paid it all."
While more fishing villages continued to be established along the northern neck coast, the menhaden industry continued to grow, especially in Reedville.
By 1885, there were 15 menhaden fish factories on this one Cockrell's Creek that goes up to Reedville. So he really got something started. And people were coming in from all over, north, south, west, to build factories and get in the fishing business and make a little money.
So all these factories were owned by different individuals.
Exactly right. Some individuals had interest in 3 factories at a time, but they were all separate entities, yeah.
Fishing boats required crews of dozens of men to operate the equipment and handle the task of finding huge schools of fish, capturing them in nets, and getting them on board the boats. For decades, the process remained the same.
The bigger boats with the big mast had powerful winches, so the men would pull by hand to get the net tight with the fish in it, and then the menhaden ship would come along, and the 2 purse boats that had set the net would tie up to the boat, the main boat, and they had a dip net, and they would dip that net down and pick up maybe several 100,000 fish at one time, and open the bottom of the net when they got it over the hole, the fish hole of the boat, and dump the fish in the boat. And they could pretty well tell how many fish they were catching by the number of bales they made, but also how high the fish were coming up in the hole of the boat.
The men in the purse boats provided the muscle, setting large nets around a school of menhaden and dragging their catch, weighing hundreds of pounds, into the boat, back-breaking work. The late Kilmarnock businessman William Crosby got his start working the purse boats on the bay.
On that net sometime, and they would cut right through your fingers and your blood would be running out your hand, and you wouldn't even feel it. I didn't feel it either. I mean, when the work gets so hard that we couldn't hardly move, we'd start singing. And that spirit would make the work easy. The spirit is what you need. Trust yourself, and all men do it. And all men do it. Trust yourself.
The songs the boatmen sang are known as sea shanties, and they continue to be performed by former menhaden fishermen today at community events, helping to preserve an important part of Chesapeake Bay history. These songs created a lasting memory for young Herb Lewis, who, as a boy, would accompany family members on the boats.
But after all the work was done on the boat, the day's work was over with, those guys would wash up and they would all come in the galley to mug up, they call it, get a snack before they went to bed. And we'd be running up the bay. You know, you had to come in every night because it wasn't in the refrigeration. You know, you had to come back to the factory every night. They would start singing gospel songs, and that was to me. I used to love to go down there as a kid and listen to them. You know, sing those songs coming up that bay.
Generation after generation, young men were introduced to the working world on Chesapeake Bay. Following World War II, young veteran Elton Smith, who would later become the first African-American school superintendent in Virginia, got work as an assistant cook aboard a menhaden boat.
I became involved with menhaden fishing as a second cook. And on Sunday afternoon, we would get the groceries, have them ready for that Monday morning.
And about how many crew members were there on the boat?
I believe there were 19. I'm not too sure. But I think there were about 19.
Finding the fish could always be a challenge until early in the 20th century when spotter aircraft joined the fleets. Forrest Dameron is a second-generation fish spotter, getting his license at age 16 and following in the footsteps of his father, Cecil Dameron.
He was a commercial fish spotter for different companies, Peck Humphreys being one, Ampro, and then he went to work for Zapata Haney, which is now Omega Protein. Basically what they do is they have vessels underneath of them. Right now there's 8. It used to be 13. He had probably more than that at one time. And he goes up, spots the fish, calls the boats, and then directs them to the fish, around the fish.
Spotting for Reedville bait, Forrest and his plane give the company's boat a much wider range than in the past.
One thing we do now that years ago is they mainly, Frederick, for instance, had 2 snapper rigs, so he was kind of stayed in the bay, Chesapeake Bay, mainly from Windmill Point to Smith Point. So with the airplanes and with the bigger boat he has today, we can travel from Virginia off the coast of Maryland. We got to stay 3 miles there, 3 miles off the coast of Delaware, and 3 miles off the coast of Jersey. So what we can do by traveling is target the bigger fish, which everybody wants for bait, and it gives the little ones time to grow.
By 1917, the war in Europe, what would later become known as World War I, reached the shores of the Northern Neck. Not actual fighting. Instead, the Navy needed boats and had its eye on the Northern Neck's Menhaden fleet. Richard Covington, president of the Northumberland Historical Society and author of the book Northern Neck Fishing Steamers Go to War, recounts the story.
May 29, 1917, a government boat called the Fishhawk, and it was a government boat, it wasn't a naval boat, but it seemed to be performing a naval function, but it landed it docked at Fleeton, and it had a lot of naval people on board as well as some civilian people, and there's a mention of that in the newspaper, but they don't go into any details. But what they were actually doing there is that they were going around and they were evaluating the boats. They were looking at the fishing boats and trying to decide which ones they could use and how much they were going to pay for them. And by April the 2nd, 1917, they had ordered those boats that they had chosen to report to the Norfolk Naval Yard.
The boats conscripted by the Navy were very different from today's modern Menhaden boats. The Navy planned to use them largely for patrol missions off the coast of France.
These were boats that were built solely for the purpose of Menhaden fishing. They were boats that have been built in a very similar fashion and style since about 1870, all along the East Coast, not just on the Chesapeake Bay, but in the New England states and all. They all used they were generally the same style of boat. They were high in the bow, low in the stern, low amidships because they had to load the fish into the cargo hold. And most of the ones that were used around here were 150 to 160 feet long with a 24-foot beam. I mean, they were not large boats. They were not small boats, but they were not boats that were intended to cross the Atlantic Ocean, but they did.
9 Northern Neck boats were selected to go to France, commanded by naval officers, but largely crewed by local fishermen.
How well suited were these boats to the tasks that they were given?
Not at all. They were very poorly suited. You probably couldn't have picked a worse style of boat. They were, like I said, they had very low freeboard, particularly aft. They were prone to rolling a lot, and when they converted them for military use, they had to build more structures up on the deck. They actually had to not only increase the number of structures, but increase the height. The ones that served in France, the ones that went overseas, actually had 2 cannons mounted on the deck, one on the aft deck and the other one up on the pilot house, and that made the boat even more top heavy.
In addition to patrolling coastal waters, the converted Menhaden fleet assisted naval vessels in finding German mines in French and British waters, bringing them to the surface and exploding them.
They did their job admirably. They really did. And I think a lot of that is because of the the people who manned those boats at that time, they knew what they were doing. They were maritime people, and they weren't scared. They weren't scared to go in any kind of weather. They weren't scared of the German submarines. They weren't worried about it. They were. It's almost like they were fearless, and they actually made the boats do the job that they were given to do. I mean, if you give those people a job, they're going to do it regardless of what you give them to do it with. You probably could have given them a 20-foot skiff, and they would have gone out and tried to do it.
And how many of them made it back?
The boats, one. One boat out of the 9. In fact, if you want to count the northern boats too, it was 11 Menhaden boats who went over there. Only one made it back.
The Margaret was the only locally built steamer in the Northern Neck fleet that assisted the Navy. The Douglas Company purchased her after the war, and she fished the Chesapeake until about 1968. Oystering in the Bay includes one of the darkest chapters in the history of Chesapeake Bay fishing. After the Civil War, the oyster harvesting industry exploded. In the 1880s, the Chesapeake Bay was the source of almost half of the world's supply of oysters, and that created a problem. New England fishermen encroached on the bay after their local oyster beds had been exhausted, and that prompted violent clashes with local fishermen from Maryland and Virginia. Oysters were a valuable commodity that sometimes attracted criminal enterprises. In 1868, Maryland founded the Maryland Oyster Police Force, nicknamed the Oyster Navy, which was the predecessor of the modern Maryland Natural Resources Police, but it was often no match for the oyster pirates. Virginia made its own attempts to fight illegal oystering. In the 1870s, Virginia imposed license fees, seasonal limits, and other measures to prevent over-harvesting and to preserve the oyster population, but found the rules were hard to enforce. There were two main ways to harvest oysters in the bay. Tonging, the method of pulling up oysters from deeper waters with the use of long metal or wooden rake-style tongs, became the preferred method of collecting oysters along the Chesapeake and Potomac waterways. In the early 1800s, a new method of collecting oysters, known as dredging, came into favor in the Northeast. This new contraption, with its metal teeth and mesh-style basket, could be dragged from a sailing vessel and reeled in, yielding a much larger catch with less effort. Though initially designed to collect only oysters in deeper waters, it was soon misused in shallower waters, where it quickly destroyed the oyster's natural habitat. After violence broke out between oyster tongers and more affluent oyster dredgers, Virginia banned oyster dredging in 1879. There were a number of pitched battles on the bay, as Maryland police and individual watermen battled oyster pirates seeking to cash in on others' work. The violence continued throughout the first half of the 20th century, especially in the Potomac River near Colonial Beach. The conflict and deaths finally came to an end in 1959, when marine authorities in the Potomac and the Bay were no longer allowed to carry firearms. Today, oysters are plentiful in the waters of Chesapeake Bay, but Forrest Dameron, a waterman who operates Penny Creek Oyster Farms, says Chesapeake Bay oystering went through some hard times until recently.
When I was a kid growing up, there weren't any oysters, more or less. They've kind of all died off with MSX, other diseases. And in the last 10 years, naturally, oysters have been coming back. It's become a big fishery for the state of Virginia in the wintertime for watermen, including myself. And also the aquaculture has kind of brought more people in the industry to put oysters in the water as seed, grow them, and sell them. So that's kind of helped the market because basically there's oysters year-round now.
Chesapeake Bay oysters are still a prized and valuable commodity. But fortunately, The oyster wars are a thing of the past.
Back then, I think oysters, those other states like Maryland was coming down, and those other, I guess the pirates were coming from other places. So now that the Chesapeake Bay has, pretty much has oysters in it in a few different places, everybody kind of stays home. So the Maryland boats stay in Maryland. The Virginia boats, we pretty much go from the Great Wacomico to the Rappahannock. You might go to the York River, and then the lower bay watermen kind of stay in the James River. Yes, you still have your own private beds that you try to keep others off. Sometimes that's not so easy, but for the most part, there's different ways now with drones and everything to, you can protect things a lot easier now than you could back then too.
As the fishing industry flourished in the 20th century, fish factories needed more skilled labor, much of which could be found in urban areas. Before long, there began a migration from cities, especially Baltimore, to the Northern Neck. For the men, it was a new career opportunity. For the women, however, it could be culture shock. In the early to mid-2000s, the Reedville Fishermen's Museum captured some of the stories of Northern Neck women in a series of oral history interviews.
The thing was, he had to convince our grandmother to leave Baltimore. She was a city girl, had been for generations, I guess. And he told her it was a good job. There were all, it was it was in the country, the children would enjoy it. And one of the things that he mainly told her was that there was a new Episcopal church just been built in Fleeton a couple years before, and they were Episcopalians, and he knew that would get her attention. And finally, he took the job. He forgot to tell her the only way she could get to church was across the creek in the boat. Grandmother didn't like water. But anyway, she came by steamboat with all their worldly possessions. Well, more than one trip. I think they sent back for things over the next months. One of the comments we have in she used to tell us about coming down on the steamboat and how dark it was and how these landings they were coming to. They got to Typers first, down where the bridge in Glee Point, and she wrote back or said there was a more desolate place she had never seen. Well, she hadn't seen Tim's Wharf by then. That's where she was going to be put ashore, and I can't imagine. I don't know exactly how they got their belongings up the road, but it wasn't easy.
Well, Gran would tell the story, and Gran was very good at telling events. It was so dark when they got here, and she could not close her eyes. It was still pitch black, but there was no light. And her only consolation was, she said, there are very few things that have even been brought up to the house. Most of it was still down on Tim's Wharf. It would not be difficult to repack everything and go back on the steamboat. But then Gran had the other side of her, Uncle Tom and Uncle Bill. When they woke up and saw that they were on Cockrell's Creek, they thought it was heavenly.
They'd gone down.
And Gran, she would say, and I knew then this was where I was going to be.
Miss Ada, what was your reaction when you came to Reedville?
I wanted to go home.
You came from Baltimore.
But then he came home and we got married in June, and I found myself down here in September. And we came down in a boat. And we ran into a storm.
Was this a steamboat or a smaller boat?
No, it was a work boat he bought.
Oh.
And we came down, and the waves were just awful, and we were off the opening to Plum Point. Have you ever heard of that? And the people took us in, and they were real nice. They gave us oyster stew. I drank the juice, he ate the oysters.
But you found Reedville to be different from Baltimore.
Oh, yeah. I don't know how people live up there.
When America entered World War II, many of the men entered military service. The women not only took up much of the community's work, but also served as volunteer wardens on the lookout for German U-boats that sometimes prowled the coast. For children, it was a reminder that the war could be close to home.
Then the other thing I remember too, I guess I was getting to be older, a little bit older, the boats, Coast Guard boats would come into Reedville. And of course we could look right straight across. And I often wondered how close the enemy was. If they came in there to tie up, and they would tie up at the ice plant, then why were they there? And of course you're almost afraid to ask. Are the Germans out there at the end of the creek or something, and they are here to protect us or whatever? But they were just tying up for overnight, I guess.
After the war, the men returned and prosperity increased throughout the region, and fishing families settled into a comfortable way of life.
Everything centered around fishing and the men, I think. And all week the women would do what they wanted. Sometimes you would stay up late, or you'd go, go to the beach all day. You didn't clean the house, but come Friday, that house was cleaned. Those kids were dressed. Those meals were cooked. That drink was ready. That's just the way you did.
Today, Northern Neck women face many of the same challenges. Captain William Blackwell, wife Kristen, daughter Charlotte, and son Dawson often face extended separations during fishing season.
When I met Bill, when we were first dating, he was the mate for my brother, Tom Moore, who is also a fishboat captain. So I've known the lifestyle, but I've never really lived it. So dating Bill, I quickly learned that when it was fishing season, I would expect him to be gone. He would leave Sunday night, and I knew I would at least see him on Friday nights. But in between, it was always whenever he had a good day and he'd unload fish, we'd see him. So it was day to day during the week. It's a tough life. It's made me very independent, with the kids, and it's just, that's all I've known. So it's very respected, because I can't even imagine what they go through out there, and it's a different lifestyle. But it's also very rewarding and exciting when he's coming in around the point in Fleeton and he's had a big day and he's loaded. Me and the kids will jump in the car and go ride around the point, and we get out and we're waving, and Dawson's doing this, blow the horn, and he'll blow the fishboat horn, and then we have about 10 or 15 minutes to book it from around the point to come back here to beat him home and be set up, have the house clean, have dinner ready, and just kind of let him come back in and relax and decompress.
For many people in the Northern Neck, fishing was a family business, providing a better income than many other occupations. Manuel and Joanne Haney both came from families rich in fishing industry heritage.
My grandfather, of course, he was a captain. I had 3 uncles that were captains on my father's side. I have such pleasant memories. You have no idea how great that was. And all those guys were fairly successful, and they were spenders. I've been in restaurants for them when they closed the doors and pulled the shades down and set the whiskey bottles on the table. It was the way.
It's a lot of money in this town at that time.
Joanne's father was John Lowry, a successful fisherman who shared his love of the Chesapeake with his daughter.
I know when Dad would go fishing, I'd go out with him on the boat. And I was probably about 7, 8, 9 years old on the boat. And I really loved being on the boat with him and watching the way these men would pull in the nets and go. I'd climb up in the masthead with my dad, be up there with him, and believe it or not, I really liked the smell of the diesel. And even the fish on the boat. There was just something about the smell of all of that was just a childhood memory, even to this day when I smell the boat, see the boats going out, and you can smell the diesel then. I thought fishing, I loved it.
I could say he worked awful hard, and he fished up at Wildwood, New Jersey most of the time. And then when they closed that operation in Wildwood, he came down here, and at that time, like she told you, he had 3 boats, 3 minesweepers. They were converted minesweepers. And anyway, he hired 3 captains to fish his boats. And he went to New York and bought a floating dry dock because he wanted a shipyard, and that took a lot to take one of the fish boats in the wintertime, go to New York, hook onto a floating dry dock and bring it down here. And then he put it up. And I think he was reasonably successful. He was really good for Zapata. Standard Products at that time, they had their own railway. So if they had a problem, if they needed to change a wheel or broke a shaft or what have you, they could haul the boat out. And by her dad getting this floating dry dock, we'd do the same thing. I've had him call me at 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, come on, we got to haul a boat.
Throughout his career, Manuel was heavily involved in modifying boats and can trace their evolution.
You know, we went from the old fish boats. A lot of them were built in people's backyards. Anyway, they started out with steam power. They started out rowing the purse boats with oars. And then they went to diesel, and they put engines in purse boats. I remember one of my uncles telling me my grandfather said they'll never catch another fish putting an engine in a purse boat because he felt like it would scare the fish. But anyway, it didn't. It worked. So they went from that old style boat to minesweepers, and they were after World War II. They were plentiful, and they were inexpensive, and they would buy one. I don't know what they paid for those minesweepers, but you know they had engines on them and they were running, and they had to convert those to fish boats.
Meet Ida Hall, a lifelong waterman, or to be more precise, waterwoman. Her father was born and raised in Lancaster County, but Ida was born in Danville, Virginia, visiting Kilmarnock often as a child.
So we were coming up here for vacations and to visit my grandparents and cousins and uncles and stuff like that for holidays and vacations. And so that's how I got connected with the property and the farm. It was a family farm, and my grandparents, my grandfather didn't do as much working on the water as his 2 brothers, Harry Hall and Eugene Hall. But he did some, but he was basically farmer and he did oysters more so.
It was on one of those trips to Kilmarnock that Ida, a young teenager, was introduced to what would become a lifelong passion. She and her brother accompanied their cousin Hal as he and his crew went to his pound nets.
So we went out. It was early morning, which I'm a morning person. It was just the setting was spectacular. The sun coming up over the bay. We're in this big boat. So we went out. I think he had out 2 traps at the time. He fished 3 sometimes. And we pull up to this, it was this lineup of poles, and you couldn't see the net, and they went into this, well, it was the false pound, which I didn't know the terminology. And then it would go into this other net that was basically, well, not totally submerged, but it was, the bulk of it was underwater. You saw some net. So just all these fish would come up, and I was just spellbound.
Did that hook you?
Oh my God, I was hooked from day one. It was like that.
During that 2-week visit, Ida returned to the bay each day with her cousin and his crew.
But I just remember the boat would just fill up with all different kinds of fish in the summer. Lots of menhaden. Depending on, in June, you'd start to see some spot. I don't know, there were a lot of croaker then, but bluefish and a few rockfish. But it was just, the bay was so productive.
By 1973, Ida was ready to try to make a living on the water, the start of a more than 50-year career.
And the big run of rockfish was over, the money maker, but there was still some. And I caught $54 worth of striped bass, and I'm like, not bad for about 30 minutes work. I can do this. And so that's how I got started, actually working on the water. But I was absolutely too terrified to go and market the crabs myself. Knew even less about that. So when Hal was catching fish, I just kind of still hang out with him. He was no longer fishing pound nets because he couldn't get the workmen, and a gill net was simpler and so forth. So he would sell my few fish there for a while, and I finally got to where I could set the net out in the bay without really major disaster. But there are a lot of crabbers and watermen out there with other nets, and so I would just I didn't want to interfere with them because I was a novice. But so I just set my net, and I was catching, there were a lot of bluefish, and I mean big bluefish. Of course, they didn't do your net any good, and you didn't get a lot of money. But I thought it was great. I just, it was just neat. I caught something. And Hal made the comment one day, he said, I've never known anybody to catch fish where you set your net. And I'm like, well, I guess I was just lucky or something.
Like Ida Hall and countless others in the Northern Neck, Forrest Dameron's life on the water began with a family connection.
I don't know, I grew up with it. My father in the winter times always had a crab dredge boat. So back before oystering started, that's what we did. Every Thanksgiving, the fishing season was kind of winding down for him, and we would rig the boat up Thanksgiving, and December 1st we would stay in the Chesapeake Bay and crab dredge from December 1st to March 31st. I have a 255 pot license, which used to be a 300 pot, but now it's currently 255. So March 17th, you can set 255 pots and fish them all summer until the season ends, which generally we go oystering in October, November because the market kind of picks up there.
And that family connection to the water continues. From the time they were very young, Brooks and Molly Ann accompanied their parents aboard their boat, with Brooks getting his own boat at an early age.
Well, I started out with a 16-foot Carolina skiff when I was about 10, I think. I got it on my 10th birthday. Then this 2 years ago, maybe a year, I got a 19-foot Carolina skiff. And that was definitely a big upgrade. You go crab pot, and I could put more pots on it and go out in the summer and go catch them. And I got a 40 pot license, and I can go catch in 4 bushels of oysters. And I'm a part of it with, I think, 6 other people, and I can go out and catch crabs and oysters by myself now.
But Brooks still enjoys fishing with his family, often accompanying his father and grandfather throughout the season. Being captain of a Menhaden boat was always a lot of responsibility, and different captains arrived on the bridge by different paths. Carol Curry, whose family worked in the industry for generations, retired as a Menhaden boat captain, but he was one of the few skippers to actually start in the purse boats. He began his journey in 1957 when he was still in high school. and witnessed a lot of change during his career.
Oh man, I think I did. I mean, it was work then, but it's, you know what, really right now it's nothing to a sock to what you had to go through then. We had when you come in at night, and the first thing you did, you had to go and get 100-pound bags of salt and pile them up on the stern, and you know, using that salt every day. And I mean, it was work. Every man had to stir the boat for an hour at night, in the daytime too. And the year I started, that was the last year that they had wooden purse boats and cotton nets.
But Curry didn't stay in the purse boats for very long. His talent, instincts, and hard work quickly led to a promotion at Reedville Oil.
I think the third year that I was on the boat, the captain told me one night, I was sitting in the galley, and he said, "Look, I don't want nobody in the pilot house but you." And so then that's what I had to do every day. You know, listen out for the other company planes, and of course one year we didn't have no planes. We didn't have no fighter planes, and that was my job. And I would tell them when where the fish was and how far it was away from me and all. But listen to another a plane from another company. Because I mean, that guy was nice enough to sort of give us a hand.
But moving up the ladder to captain, well, that took a little longer.
I went mate 20 years before they would give me a boat. And but that's how I got out. I mean, the man that I was fishing with, I owe a lot to him, because I mean, he would take a chart that days and nothing wasn't going on, or like a Fridays, and we would run him back up the bay to the plant, open it up and show it, show me what was on it, and how to do this and how to do that, and he really did.
His first day as captain did not get off to a great start.
The crew we had on that was pitiful. It really, really was. So anyway, we made it through that day, and so Captain Carlisle France, he was on that, and so he took I went on let him steer the boat around, the job that I had. And I told him in the pilot, I said, I can tell you one thing, I said, I'm going to go see and I'll find some men. I said, we ain't going to make it like this. So anyway, I jumped in my truck when we got in, and I got everybody back, the crew that we had, except 3 men. And we fished 3 days. Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, yeah, and I mean we had a great big week. We really did, by having experienced men.
Mm-hmm. Meredith Robbins started piloting tugboats on the James River. After serving in the Korean War, when he returned home, he was ready for a change.
But anyway, when I got back from Korea, I never was too satisfied towboating. So I had a good friend who had made captain. His name was Dave Biggle, and it was his first year captain. So he asked if I would be interested in going pilot for him. So I took that position. After 3 years with him, I knew that in order to become a captain of a fish boat, you have to go through the mate. The pilot stays strictly on the boat, so you could stay there forever. So anyway, I left and went with another captain, and he said, well, next year I'll give you a mate's job.
After working as a mate for 3 or 4 years, Robbins was made captain and worked several years in the Gulf of Mexico for Standard Products. When he returned to the Northern Neck, the industry had modernized considerably.
And after a couple so years, they were getting much larger boats, refrigerated boats. And he had one, that factory down near Wilmington, North Carolina, called Southport. And he asked me if I would like to. In fact, the fish spotter, a fellow by the name of Bob Kill, approached me and said, you know, you go down there, take that boat, and you can catch 50 million. I said, I'm off.
As profitable as fishing could be, the bay and the ocean could also present great danger, something an experienced captain always had to be ready to address.
I had some close calls, got hooked in a couple storms. We lost a boat. We didn't, but a competing company. One fall, we had a northwester came through, and I had, all of us, just about, had been fishing up around Hatteras. And we were heading back home, and we got a report that there would be strong winds and to be prepared for it. So blessed Lord, the storm hit us about 3 hours out, and we were in a fleet of boats, and one of the boats capsized. So that wasn't good at all. I said, of course, the company was monitoring us, and they knew I was pretty much loaded, so they had one boat that wasn't quite so, didn't have such a load, and they asked him to stand by me to make sure. And blessed Lord, that's when we discovered we had one boat that had turned over. So he had to leave me and go over and assist and look for the people. And he managed to save 7 of the guys. I knew them pretty much. So I had one of the engineers on there. I asked him about what went on, and he said the ones that were lost left the boat very soon when she rolled over. He and his son, which was an engineer with him, stayed with the boat. So they managed this guy. His name was Ernest Delana. It was a remarkable rescue.
Over the years, the Bay and the Atlantic claimed many others. Today, at the Reedville Fishermen's Museum, there is a monument honoring local fishermen lost at sea. Today, there is one Menhaden factory on Cockrell's Creek. In fact, where there was once as many as 25 fish factories on the East Coast, today there's just one, Omega Protein, with boats owned and operated by ocean harvesters.
We operate 9 vessels now. We catch about a little over 70% of the coastwide allocation of Menhaden. And we catch those fish anywhere from as far north as Long Island, New York, down to Cape Lookout, North Carolina, off the coast there. The other 28 or 28% of Menhaden coastwide are caught by the bait industry. And again, the bait industry is very active here in Reedville also, with 2 pretty large bait harvesters who purse seine. There's considerable bait industry in Maryland, mostly from gill netting and pound netting, and from New Jersey, from purse seining, as well as up in Maine and some of the New England states who catch Menhaden. And most of Menhaden bait today is used for lobster bait, crab bait, or chum and things like that.
The newest of Ocean Harvester's ship is the Reedville, captained by Northern Neck native William Blackwell.
This boat right here last year was her first year fishing. She was christened last spring. I think the boat's around 180 feet long. She's 40 foot wide. We carry 16 people aboard this boat.
The captain and crew of the Reedville not only are experienced Menhaden fishermen, most come from a long line of Menhaden fishermen.
My father was a fish boat captain, and there's a lot. Most of my guys on here are second, third generation. You know, it's the cool thing about it. You know, this has been one of the biggest employers and people that came for their livelihood in the Tri-County area. You know, this is and it still is today. And you know, it's one of they always say if fishing's in your blood. You know, and I tell you, it's funny. When I started fishing 21 years ago, and again, my father was a fish boat captain, and I remember going out with him. You know, when I was young, 6, 7, 8 years old, me and my sister. I didn't know that that's what I wanted to do. When I first got out of high school, and then a year or two after high school, that's when I said, hey, let me go try this. And of course, I was in the crew, and coming out of high school, my hands were kind of soft, you know. And we were pulling them nets all day, and I remember like the first or second week, I was laying in my bunk and my hands hurt so bad. And I said, I don't know if this is for me or not.
You have to sing one of those sea shanties.
Yeah. But
the Reedville is a thoroughly modern ship, a far cry from the vessels operated by Elijah Reed. The bridge is outfitted with every modern navigation device, and unlike those ships of old, there is no steering wheel.
Obviously, this right here is electric over hydraulic. So port, starboard. Same thing with this little guy right here. Port, they just give me if I want to lay back. And then we also have, this is our autopilot here. So if I'm steering in a straight direction for a long time, I can use this guy, and then I don't have to touch any of this. The boat steers itself, basically. I still have to be here, obviously. But, and again, they have not pinched any pendants on any of our equipment. We have our radars, chart plotters. We have a backup camera. That's what I call it. It's a backup. What it is a camera that's focusing on the purse boats when I'm raising them up, make sure everything, because I can't see them visually. We have, that's another GPS system. We have our depth recorder, VHF radios, obviously. This is our FM set. This is what we talk to our planes with.
What gives Menhaden its value? What makes this it's a little fish, you can't eat it.
Yeah, I would say that its value comes from its numbers and its ability to reproduce. A single Menhaden will lay up to 350,000 eggs, and it may lay eggs several times in a year. It grows fast. Atlantic Menhaden typically don't live beyond 5 or 6 years old, but they start spawning as early as 1 year old. So they're literally laying billions of eggs in their lifetime, depending on how long they live. When you think about the history of this industry, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even early 80s, when there were a lot of fish plants on the East Coast, there were anywhere from 500 to 700,000 metric tons of Menhaden landed each year along the Atlantic coast, again, from Maine to Florida. This is a very robust resource. And doing that for 40 or 50 years, and you really did not harm that fishery to a point where it ever collapsed. You heard people say it was going to collapse, but it didn't. Today, the coast-wide quota or allocation is only about 235,000 metric tons. So only a third of what was caught for decades, and the biomass was not harmed, you know, to a terrible degree then, and we're hardly scratching the surface now.
It was the best game in town. There were some farming jobs, but there really weren't many jobs around here. You either worked on the water as a crabber and an oysterman, or you went with the Menhaden factories.
But I'm telling you, I'm sitting here at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning when I can't sleep and watching boats go out. And I just miss it like you wouldn't believe.
No matter where you go in the Northern Neck, there are reminders of how the bay and fishing have left an indelible mark on a region and its people, both in the past and in the present. Whether it's Main Street in Reedville, lined with the homes of early 20th century boat captains, or the remnants of some of the more than dozen fish factories that once dotted Cockrell's Creek and employed hundreds of people. Long poles for pound nets, or the fishing boat prominently featured in the logo for Lee's Restaurant. The bay and fishing are a huge part of the Northern Neck's history and culture, and there's every reason to believe they will be part of the future as well.